let's get on with it. Where are you going? I think that this is always an interesting question. I used to raise this question because if you don't reflect on where you're going, then you don't tend to get there. Now, there's a tradition in that Peter was in Rome, and Nero was having a persecution, and Peter decided to get out of Dodge, which seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do when they're doing nasty things. Nero is capturing Christians, covering them with tar, and lighting them as torches in his garden parties. These are not nice people. And Peter is said to have been leaving Rome in view of the persecutions, and he had a vision. He met Christ carrying a cross, walking towards Rome. And he said to Jesus, "Quo vadis, Domine?" which means, "Where are you going, Lord?" And there was a movie actually made of that title, and I've always liked that because of that. And Christ said to him that he was going to Rome again to be crucified. And that, because of what was happening to his church, his people in Rome. And that so moved Peter that he turned, went back to Rome, and he was crucified upside down, as tradition tells us, because he didn't want to be crucified in the regular position, because that's the way Christ had been crucified. He didn't feel that he was good enough, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Remember that remark Christ made of Peter when Peter was telling him not to think the way he was thinking? Well, we have a question that we should contemplate as we sum up our investigations of the Shroud of Turin. Where are we going? Where are we going on our journey in life? Where are we going in terms of this journey on the Shroud of Turin? Do we believe the Shroud is authentic? Do we believe the Shroud is some sort of medieval forgery? The path we've traveled so far is we've looked at religion initially. We looked at science, we looked at history, we looked at the problems that the image creates because it is such an unusual and difficult image to duplicate. Nobody's been able to duplicate it. Nobody knows how it was made. It is a mystery, and because it is such a deep mystery, many of the people who believe that it's authentic have started talking about things like a flash of light at the resurrection, or some mysterious force that took place that maybe the body dematerialized and the cloth fell through the shroud fell through the body image as the body dematerialized. All kinds of wild theories, which can't really, scientifically, these kind of theories can't be verified, but they can be studied. In some cases, they have side effects that could be looked for, and we're going to talk a little bit today about some of those. So today's program is we're going to be talking about weighing the evidence. We're going to do a quick run through on what we've seen. Then we're going to look at Russ Brialt's Christian perspective, because Russ has an interesting presentation he gave. I thought a little bit about actually showing you Russ's presentation, but it's 88 minutes long. And I decided that I would synopsize Russ's presentation. But I do want to say that the presentation, when we go through that is entirely due to Russ Brialt. He does a brilliant job on it. If you get a chance to see him do stuff, or if you're interested, you can go to his shroudencounter.com website, and I suspect the video is probably available. Then I'm going to talk about thoughts for the future. There's some new results that came out at St. Louis that are interesting. There's even been some new results that have popped into my email box just the last few days. I get way too much email. I get about 150 emails every morning, and I have to kind of go through them, but the ones that are among the most valuable are the ones that report on interesting things going on in the Shroud world. And then we'll talk maybe briefly about where things might go, and then a final challenge to sum up the program. So weighing the evidence. What do I mean by weighing the evidence? Well, remember at the very beginning of the program, we had a question about what is truth? Pilate's question of Christ. What is truth? And in order to answer a question like what is truth, you have to have some form of standards to evaluate truth. And the standard that I presented was these 4 levels of investigation associated with truth. Direct observation, witnesses, preferably eyewitnesses. Correct interpretation. Do we understand what's being said accurately? Do we understand the information we're getting? Does it correspond with other known truths so it doesn't contradict something known to be true? And what about overall coherence? Well, I've tried to follow those standards in the course of preparing this series of lectures. They are all an effort to answer the question, what is truth? Because ultimately, the test of story is it true? Even stories that are fictional, the test of the story is it true? This is a factual story, so it has to rise to a higher standard than things like myths and fictional things. Now, coherence. By coherence, I mean links that tie things together. And we looked at quite a number of coherence-oriented things. We looked at the journey of the Shroud. There's some question about how it journeyed all the way from Jerusalem to Edessa, to Constantinople, to Athens, to Besançon, to Liri, and to Chambéry, and finally to Turin, where it resides today. And we looked at that a little bit. We looked at evidences associated with the Shroud. What about the sudarium, the cloth of Oviedo that surrounded Christ's head? Similar pollens were found on both cloths. That's a correspondence. The Shroud shares artistic markings with the Mandylion, which suggests that the Shroud and the Mandylion are the same object, tetradiplon, and so forth. And finally, we touched on the image characteristics. So let's look at that. We'll go look. I've got a slide for kind of each of those steps. In religion, we started by looking at what is the Passion of Christ look like. By the way, there's the titulus I was talking about earlier. I took a clip of that and tied it with a clip of the titulus from the special that was done on Sunday. This one's more accurate than what they. This is Monsignor Giulio Risi's artistic recreation of the crucifixion based on the wounds on the Shroud. We looked at the markings on the Shroud, the fact of the signs of the beating, the scourging, the crowning with thorns, which was done with a cap of thorns, more like an actual ancient crown, as opposed to this little laurel that was really kind of something a laurel wreath was something they put on an Olympic hero after he he won the Olympics in the ancient Greek tradition. And also a laurel was put on the brow of a Roman who was receiving a triumph. And there would be a slave that would be in the chariot as the triumph progressed. And the guy who's being honored has a laurel wreath, and there's a slave in the chariot with him saying, "This too shall pass." And in the context of Ash Wednesday, that's an interesting. It has nothing to do with the Shroud, but in Ash Wednesday, you're told, "Remember, man, that thou art dust; from dust thou came, and unto dust thou shalt return." So there's a certain humility, but the crown of thorns was something major. He carried his cross, and there's marks on the back that show blurring of which suggests the patibulum, the crossbeam, was being carried and rubbing against the shoulders, which also indicated that the man was wearing a garment, because had he been rubbing against his raw flesh, the whole section would have been rubbed raw, and there would have been blood all over the shroud, the back at that point, which would, much of it would have transferred to the shroud as a big blob. Instead, it was, the blood stains were blurred, which means that if we actually do have that relic somewhere, we can test its blood. It should have blood on it, assuming some dingbat didn't, wash it. But then, we know, you don't know what you don't know until you look. He was nailed to the cross, and it was through the wrists. Died. We have a piercing wound on the right chest. And finally, he was buried in an empty tomb. And we are told that the tomb was found empty, and he was raised on the third day. He was on the day of April 3rd, 33 AD, there was a blood moon. There was very near sunset, there was a total eclipse of the moon in Jerusalem. And interestingly, when Peter talked about Jesus some days later at Pentecost, he mentions the prophet Joel and a blood moon, which is why I prefer April 3rd, 33 AD to April 7th, 30 AD, which are the two days that are commonly cited for the crucifixion. Finally, we have an empty tomb, and I stuck this in because we don't know what happened in that empty tomb. The women came, there were two angels in one account, there were angels in another account. In some account, Mary Magdalene met a gardener and spoke to him, and then only then recognized him as the Lord. It's quite a mystery just what went on in the garden. But we do have coherence on the shroud with all of these wounds that correspond to the Passion. What about history? Well, we took a journey in history from basically 33 AD all the way to the present. There were a few places where we can't really fill in the story perfectly, but we did pretty well. We had the Abgar story, and we have some other stories, all that tend to link a image of Christ to the city of Edessa. And in Edessa, we have additional remarks about the and interestingly enough, Edessa in 544, the shroud was, or the Mandylion at that time, was given responsibility for saving the city from a Persian army. And right about the same time, images of Christ all of a sudden grew beards, became frontal, had very large eyes, two little wisps of hair that might be a misunderstanding of the blood stain on the forehead. Remember how faint the actual shroud image is, but only a face. And Paul Vignon thought that was probably due to the shroud markings he identified, and later on Ian Wilson used the reference to the shroud as tetradiplon, that is folded in 8, so that there were 8 layers, to suggest that the Mandylion and the shroud were the same object. Now, this is not accepted by all historians by any means. On the other hand, it's a very coherent account. It fits the data. And I'm a scientist, I am data-driven. I think it fits the data pretty well. The main problem with that particular identification is all the pictures that are said to be the pictures of the Mandylion. And they're all positives. But if you were an artist, would you paint that, or would you use that image that's on the window there? Would you use that image as an indication of general features and then paint a positive? I think artists would always paint a positive. They don't want to confuse people. They're confused enough themselves. So now we go to Constantinople because an army was sent. And notice that when the army was sent and there was a representation of the journey of the return, this is the leader of the army bringing the Mandylion to the leader of Constantinople, and lo and behold, there's an image of a head, but there's a whole bunch of cloth. suggesting that indeed the image was the Mandylion. Then the Crusaders of the Fourth Crusade took everything that was loose and could be mobilized, and the Mandylion was among those. The shroud that Robert de Clary saw lifted up every Friday was taken. And all of a sudden in Constantinople, over a course of some few centuries, certain reverent practices developed. A practice of putting a shroud-like image of Christ on the altar at Easter time that was very similar in many cases to the shroud image. The image of the man of pity rising out of a box was reminiscent of what Robert de Clary saw. And then there are markings on the shroud which, when interpreted properly, become evidence of a mechanism used to pull the shroud out of a box, which John Jackson actually reproduced a mechanism. So we have a lot of continuity. That's that coherence. The story hangs together. Finally, we find the shroud being exhibited in Leary, and we find in Templecombe an interesting cover of what may have been a reliquary owned by the Knights Templar that is reminiscent again of this tetradiplon folding of the shroud. Science really met the shroud in 1902, 1898 as the aftermath of Secunda Pia's work, and then there was some science done by Paul Vignon, and then things went pretty quiet until around 1973 when a small sample, the Reyes sample, was taken, and Max Fry got a chance to pull sticky tapes from the shroud. But the thing that really motivated the science was the discovery of the three-dimensional data on the shroud. Wow, that was. By the way, I don't think they mentioned that in that documentary that was on Sun. I mean, how can you give a documentary about the shroud and not mention the three-dimensional information? They kind of ticked me off. But anyway, this fact motivated a scientific congress or meeting in Albuquerque in 1977, and that Albuquerque conference produced a document which was sent to Turin. Actually, some of the scientists were invited to Turin, and they were so impressed that they allowed the scientists to access to the shroud. Initially, it was only going to be 12 hours, but they got 120 hours to do all kinds of science on the shroud. And finally, I put this picture up because that's Ray Downing's rendering of the shroud image from the documentary, The Face of Christ. So who do you say that I am? That's a question that Christ addressed to his apostles. Who do you say that I am? Who do men say that I am is what he said initially. Later he addressed to the apostles themselves, who do you say that I am? So I thought we should probably look at Russ Briault's answer to this question. Is there a message that we're missing? Russ Briault, I think I mentioned before, gives kind of evangelical treatments of the shroud. So I wanted to synopsize one. If we look at everything we've seen, we have to ask the question, if the shroud is authentic, does it point beyond our current reality in any way? And Russ talks about 7 key concepts. The shroud reflects the light of Scripture. So the 7 concepts are derived, the ones I'm going to present are derived directly from Russ Briault's presentation. I haven't changed anything. There's a couple places where I put a tweak in of my own, and when we hit those, I'll say, here's a tweak I added. But I've condensed his presentation quite a lot because his presentation runs 88 minutes, and if I brought the video and showed it to you, we wouldn't have any time left for me to talk, and I like to talk to you guys, and I didn't want to do that. So concept one, is there a message in the mystery? The irony is that if the shroud were merely a work of art, we'd have probably figured that out a long time ago. It's like what Barry Schwartz says that he was expecting when he went on the Shroud expedition. He tells everybody he was expecting to walk in, take his little magnifier. Barry is a documenting photographer for the Shroud Research Project, walk up to the shroud, look at it with his magnifier, declare it a fake, and walk out. And he always says that just before he says, and here I am, still working on the Shroud of Turin all these years later. What's a good Jewish boy like me doing that? Interesting, very interesting. All the deep things of God are mysteries, says Russ, and he identifies a number of them. The incarnation, the resurrection. How did Jesus calm a storm with a word? What about feeding 5,000 with a few fishes and loaves? Russ calls it a boy's lunch. Feeding 5,000 with a boy's lunch. And then he concludes, maybe the mystery is the message. Concept two, when is a scorch not a scorch? This kind of refers to the nature of the shroud image. There's no pigment. It's superficial. Everyone who's looked at the image says it has the color that's very similar to the color of the burn scorch marks, at least the lightly scorched marks, that are near it from the 1532 fire. But the scorch marks fluoresce under ultraviolet light. But the shroud image doesn't fluoresce. So even though they look like they're the same color, they can't have been produced by the same process. Because a scorch fluoresces and the shroud image does not fluoresce. And he then added these other things. When is a wind not a wind? Well, how about when at the time of Pentecost the apostles heard the sound of a great wind just before a fire that was not a fire descended on the heads of the apostles, tongues of fire. And what about burning bushes? Moses came down from the mountain and his face was radiant. Clues to the shroud image? When is light not heat? Light was the first act of the creation. And I added the transfiguration in honor of the lady that asked me about the transfiguration, but also that's a good point. Christ was glowing. And I might add, in addition, that in Christian tradition, there are many saints who've had phenomena of been described as glowing. Now, I don't know how bright, we didn't have a light meter to check them out, but there is a lot of testimony that people that are in an elevated state of grace, in some sense, glow. So that's concept two. Concept three is interesting. It's the concept of the requirement for a witness. It's a biblical principle that when deciding the truth of anything, it isn't enough to have a single witness. You must have 2 or 3 witnesses. Otherwise, you can't accept the thing in a court in biblical terms as true. So you have to have 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, if the shroud's authentic, does God exempt himself from his own requirements? Or is there a need for 3 witnesses? Every miracle of Jesus had numerous eyewitnesses. And his appearances after the resurrection He's reported to have addressed 500 people at the same time. He appeared to the disciples. He walked with two men to Emmaus. But no eyewitnesses for the resurrection. Well, Russ doesn't think so. Russ thinks there's three witnesses. The first witness is the empty tomb. The second witness is the vacant, I don't know why he said vacant, burial shroud. The fact that, I think what he means by vacant burial shroud is that the shroud was wrapped around Jesus and there was a loop of cloth binding the shroud in place. And when they found but this is an idea that John Jackson advances. When they found the body, they found the shroud collapsed, but the binding was still in place. Nobody stealing a body would have gone to the trouble of re-wrapping the binding around the shroud. So somehow the body left the shroud in place. Now, we don't have biblical authority for that. That's a thesis, the concept that somehow after the cloth was wrapped around Jesus, it was kind of held in place by a winding strap. Possibly the side strap that may have been then reattached. And the third witness is the napkin that was around his head, which is the sudarium of Oviedo. We have all three witnesses today. Because with God, a witness to a divine event is a witness for all generations. Okay. Concept 4. And this is when kind of Russ got me. The first time I saw this presentation of Russ's was actually back in October last year at the St. Louis conference. He gave this talk. He had given it many times, I just hadn't managed to see it. And he kind of got me on this one. The proof of purchase. The shroud is a proof of purchase. You're bought. You are not your own. No, and Russ tries to always motivate each of his things with a scripture. Says, you are not your own. You were bought at a price. So if you were bought, what do you get when you buy something? Well, you get the thing itself, but you also get something else. You were purchased. Therefore take heed to yourselves and to all the flock, which he purchased with his own blood. You're redeemed, knowing that you are not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. You are ransomed, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. A transition has occurred, a transaction has occurred, a payment has been made on our behalf. So then Russ says, where's the receipt? Where's the receipt? Never thought about it that way. Do you think? I didn't realize God had to give you a receipt when he made you, when he bought you and redeemed you. But I thought when he first said that to me, I thought, yeah, that's a pretty cool idea. Where's the receipt? And the receipt shows the price that was paid after, and after that, it's the proof of purchase. So the Shroud of Turin is not only a receipt, which shows the price that was paid, but it's an itemized receipt because it shows each of the prices that was paid. The crown of thorns, the wound in the side, the scourging, all of those. Proof of purchase. We have been purchased, we belong to Christ, and we have a receipt to prove it. Paid in full. So this is Russ's concept 5. This is interesting too, because we really didn't get into the issue about the linen. The theology of linen. This is kind of interesting. From Genesis to Revelation, Jesus begins his life in swaddling clothes, and he ends it in a burial shroud. Fine twisted linen is mandated for use in the tabernacle, and it's required by priestly tunics in the Jewish practice.
David was clothed in fine linen. 7 angels clothed in spotless white linen are reported in Revelations at the wedding of the Lamb. The bride wears fine linen, bright and clean. Who is the bride?
The church.
The church is the bride of Christ. Remember, Christ was always referring to himself as the bridegroom. The bride is the church. The bride in Revelations at the wedding of the Lamb that is Christ, the wedding of Christ to his church, which is, by the way, goes back to Paul's discussion in, I'm not sure, I think it's 1 Corinthians, but I'm not positive. He talks about we are the body of Christ, and then the body of Christ is the church. Christ, the wedding of the Lamb, is the commitment to the church. The shroud is fine twisted linen. In fact, the shroud is such fine linen that it's extraordinarily difficult to find another example. In the ancient world, the weave of the shroud has been found in silk. It's been found in wool. But there is no ancient 3-in-1 twill linen. When the carbon-14 date was set, the carbon labs were supposed to find a sample, and the test was supposed to be a blind test. They were supposed to find samples that had the same weave as the shroud. They were unable to find any samples contemporary with any known period of the shroud in a 3-in-1 linen and a 3-in-1 twill. It's a very interesting fact. Where did Joseph of Arimathea get this cloth? The temple store is the most likely place, because you're not going to find fine linen on sale the day before a high holy day in the marketplace. But the temple kept a store of linen from which priestly garments were made, and particularly the high priestly garment. So that's fascinating, and as far as I know, that's true. And one of the practices, they didn't wash the priestly garments, according to at least one reference I read. They were required to keep them, and when they finally became dirty, they had to be burned, which might account for the missing linen. Finding it hard to find examples of it. So the shroud is a fine twisted linen. It's expensive and rare, and the answer is wrapped up in Joseph of Arimathea. He was a Pharisee. He was connected with the temple. He had access to the temple store. So we had a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, as a reference to Hebrews 4:14. And maybe a clue to the identity of Jesus. By the way, this is a slide that was snipped out of Russ's presentation. Pharisee, connected with the temple, access to the temple store. Did he purchase the cloth made of fine twisted linen to send a message? What would the message be? Perhaps Hebrews 4:14. A great high priest buried in a high priest's garment. Concept 6, transformation. Is the shroud a sign, and if so, for what purpose? Thoughts on the first miracle. Water was converted to wine, a sign of transformation. The effect of ministry, the ministry of transformation. I always liked, C.S. Lewis made a reference to the water being turned into wine, and his comment was that this was a miracle, but what we don't attend to is the fact that water is turned into wine all the time. It's turned into wine by grapes and fermentation in a slower process. Why isn't that a miracle? It is. We just don't, we think we understand that miracle. So there is some issues The first of the signs through which he revealed his glory in John 2:11. These are written that you may believe the purpose of the word and the shroud are the same. Believing you may have life in his name. And this is from John 20:30-31. So the shroud is a sign of transformation, traveling from water, blood to spirit, and it's a sign of our own transformation as well, presumably. What do we mean by transformation? And we all knew who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. That's from 2 Corinthians. The ultimate transformation is the resurrection. And if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you. So we're talking transformation here. The face. In the Old Testament, no one ever saw the face of God. That's interesting. Moses was told by God, he said to God, "Now show me your glory." And God replied, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. You may see my back, but my face must not be seen." It's interesting, we have the front of the shroud, which includes Jesus' face, and the back. But also, Jesus said he had to go to his Father. This is in the Gospel of John, and he was talking to Philip. And Philip, being just about as clueless as all the other apostles, said, "Show us the Father." And Christ responded, "Philip, you bonehead, I've been with you all this time, and you don't know that when you see me, you see the Father?" So there is this issue that Christ is showing us the Father in his human characteristic. Everything changes. The New Testament, everything changes. The Word becomes flesh and made its dwelling among us. We have seen his glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Again, John. The blessings of the Lord. When the face of the Lord turns towards you, it means blessing and favor. Okay? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. That's from Numbers 6. I will set my face against you. So when we turn away from God, then he sets his face against the person who turns to mediums and spiritualists and the like. If you reject my decrees and abhor my laws and fail to carry out my commands and so violate my covenant, I will set my face against you so that you will be defeated by your enemies. So when God turns his face away from us, we face destruction. The Lord said to Moses, "Forsake me and you will break the covenant I made with them. On that day I will become angry with them and forsake them. I will hide my face from them and they will be destroyed." And David pleads with God, "Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger." So the face is pretty important. Our rebellion, and this you got to remember, this is Russ Briald. He's doing this evangelical thing, and he's going to make a altar call here. I'm going to skip that particular segment, but it's perfectly understandable because I think he's made the case. But your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he will not hear. What we must do: if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. It's kind of interesting that yesterday Benjamin Netanyahu was addressing Congress. There was pure accident, of course, that I'm giving this but Eterna says, forgive their sin and we will heal their land. The face of Christ, to see the face of Christ is to see the glory of God. That's for God who said, let light shine out in the darkness, made his light to shine in our hearts, to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. The glory of God is revealed in the face of Christ. So that's the last concept that Russ presented. Now, I added to show us the Father because I always thought that that was a really powerful moment when Philip asked that question of Christ, show us the Father. Christ, when you see me, Philip. So why is the shroud face significant? In Christ we're fully forgiven and accepted. Therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, because through Christ Jesus the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. Romans 8:1 and 2. And finally on the cross Christ said, it is finished. As of God's judgment for sin was placed on, all of God's judgment for sin was placed on Christ and not on us. So seeing the face of Christ on the shroud is a sign of God's acceptance. He is not turning or hiding his face from us. We behold his face because he loves us and has freely forgiven us in Christ. But it's not unconditional. God's love is unconditional love, but it is conditioned. Capstone verse is, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever should believe in him shall not perish but have eternal life. John 3:16. God's acceptance is not without condition. We must believe and become followers of Christ. And that means we have to open the door. God has accepted you in Christ. Have you accepted him? Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me. Revelation 3:20. That's a challenge. It reminds me of the apostles in Emmaus, who only recognized Jesus in the breaking of the bread. So these are the 7 theological, powerful proofs that Russ Briault offers, purely from a theological point of view, I might add. But I think he hangs it together pretty well. It remains a mystery. The shroud is an enduring mystery. When is a scorch not a scorch? It's a witness. There are 3. It's one of 3 witnesses. The shroud is a receipt, proof of purchase. We have been bought. It is fine linen, suitable for a high priest about to enter the Holy of Holies. It is a sign of transformation. Transformation from an empty tomb to a glorified body. And the face. We are totally accepted in Christ. But we're moving beyond now, well, beyond might not be the right word, but we're moving to a different plane of existence from Russ Briault's as we look at death and resurrection. The shroud clearly shows death, but there's a secondary question, which is the one that everybody puts, everybody who are sort of giving up on how do you make a shroud, say, does the shroud show resurrection? So let's look at a few things. Remember I talked, I think last time, or one of the times anyway, about 2 kinds of miracles. One kind of miracle is supernatural. Everybody would agree it's supernatural. Turning water into wine instantly is supernatural. And the other kind of miracle is a miracle, the second kind, which might also be
referred to as the water into wine. Turning water into wine with grapes and fermentation that's not quite fair, because I think most people wouldn't accept that as a miracle, because it doesn't have maybe a religious context or a religious, but there are things that are commonly seen as miracles, because in order for them to happen, a remarkable number of things had to come together, individually rare, to produce a result which has a religious significance. That's what I call miracle of the second kind. Formally speaking, it's not supernatural, but probabilistically speaking, it might as well be, because the probability of that kind of thing happening is so remote, especially given that it has a religious context in which it happened. Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit today about two presentations that were given at the St. Louis conference. There are a lot of presentations given. These two sort of fit my narrative, so these are the ones I'm going to talk about, but I could have talked, I suppose, about a lot of other presentations that were given. There were over 30 presentations given over a 3-day period. I forget how many there were, but it was a really intense conference. The first paper is Robert Rucker's paper. He is a nuclear scientist, and he gave a MCNP, which is a modeling system for modeling nuclear reactions, an analysis of neutrons released from Jesus' body in the resurrection. That's the title. And this would then be a miracle of the first kind, because human bodies do not normally emit low temperature neutrons. I mean, we just don't. The next one we're going to look at is Spicer and Toten's paper, Electric Charge Separation as the Mechanism for Image Formation of the Shroud of Turin, a natural mechanism. Now, this is kind of interesting, because remember we had Vignon, who has a vapor graph, vapors rising from the body. We had Ray Rogers, who has vapors rising from the body to produce an image in a thin impurity layer. And now, but both of those suffer from the fact that diffusion would normally force those images to be blurry. So the interesting thing about Spicer and Toten is they claim that their images would be sharper. Okay, so let's take a look at this. First, we'll look at Rucker's paper. He starts by talking a little bit about neutron flux that causes, as a cause for carbon-14 enrichment. Now, what exactly happens in that? Well, normally a C12 atom, that's the common non-radioactive isotope of carbon, has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Carbon-14 has 6 protons and 8 neutrons. So if I irradiate with slow thermal neutrons, the significant thing is that they're slow, because if they're fast, they would shatter a nucleus. But if they're slow, they can be captured by a nucleus. And if you get 2 neutrons captured by a C12, you get a C14. Now, C14 is present at very minute quantities. The amount of C14 in something that's used to date is just a very, very tiny amount. So if I add the least little bit of C14 to selectively, I'm not adding more carbon-12, I'm adding more carbon-14, then I make something younger fast. The more I do that, the faster they get. Now, there are 3 mysteries about the Shroud of Turin. First of all, the bad carbon date. How can it be authentic when it dates to the Middle Ages? Why was there such poor agreement between the carbon-14 dates in the 3 samples? They didn't agree as well as they should have, and I use that to say there's something incompatible about the sample. And I hold that that's still true, but the question they're going to try to answer is, why is it incompatible? Can we explain the incompatibility using some sort of process? Why was there such poor agreement between, okay, I mentioned that one. How can the Sudarium of Oviedo be authentic? It carbon dates to 700 AD. Now, frankly, there's controversy about how good the carbon dating of Sudarium of Oviedo was, but it is true that the Sudarium
doesn't carbon date right either. So what's going on? It carbon dates so much earlier than the Shroud of Turin that the fact that there are image correspondences in the bloodstains between the Sudarium and the Shroud of Turin doesn't change the applicability of the argument that the Sudarium disproves the Shroud carbon date. But what about the Sudarium's carbon date? That's interesting. Well, what Rucker claims is he thinks he has one hypothesis which explains all of the data. That caught my attention at the conference. I said, bong, I'm going to listen to this. This sounds really interesting. So what does he propose? He actually did a model of the situation. He created a mathematical model of a first century tomb. And he made it sort of a U-shaped tomb. You kind of walk into the tomb, and there's a platform. It's cut out of stone. The body would be about here, and the face cloth that covered Jesus' head would have been folded up to the side, which St. John talks about in his gospel account. That's the Sudarium of Oviedo. So that's the model of the situation. Now he had to have a body, so he made one of these. Remember those little wooden figures that you could stack? He sort of took something like that and made a body. This is not a real high resolution body, you understand, but you know, there's not, for what he's trying to do, that you don't want to necessarily go to all the trouble of making a high resolution one. This kind of represents the amount of biological material that was present, and then the shroud would be modeled as just going around that body. This is the side view, this is the top view. There's a lot of body here, there's relatively less body here. This is the location where the sample was taken. And he ran a simulation.
Oh my goodness.
Now, frankly, I don't expect you to track this, and this, by the way, is part of a much longer presentation. I am summarizing the presentation quite a bit. But basically, this is the platform where the body is. The body is lying here. Notice the dates. These are the dates that the simulation says that the cloth would show in the various locations. If a cloth was in these various locations, this is the date it would show. So up here are the dates that are consistent, in fact, with the dates of the bad carbon date for the edge of the shroud. Notice these very high dates. These would be dates far in the future. 3800 and whatever, 3654. That's 3,604. Well, what happens is if you enrich the carbon-14 enough, instead of dating to the past, it dates to the future, because there's too much carbon-14. Because the way carbon-14 works, there's an existing amount of carbon-14 that is produced by cosmic rays and things interacting with the atmosphere that's then absorbed into the object, like the linen, and that produces a certain amount of carbon-14. That's today. So that would be 2014. If there's more carbon-14 than that, then it has to be younger. If it's less, it's older. So, and then over here is where he had the Sudarium mapped. And over here you get dates like 700, here's 704. And if the Sudarium had been over here, you would get similar dates in the high 600s. So that's interesting. He also then took a detailed look at the dates that were produced by the carbon-14 data, and the dates that would be produced at those same locations by his calculated points. So here's the calculated points. The green dot is a calculated point with the fit, and these 3 points are the data from the carbon-14. So what he's got here is a claim that if you have a certain amount of carbon flux, of neutron flux, you will fit all of the samples the Sudarium and the 3 samples from the carbon labs, and you would also have a prediction of what dates might be if you took other carbon samples. Now, why would the body emit thermal neutrons? Well, I don't know. Resurrection is a thermal neutron emitting process. By the way, the amount of thermal neutrons that are emitted was a tiny, tiny fraction of the neutrons in the body. So this would not have been a big effect. It wouldn't have been a damaging effect. It wouldn't have been a thermal effect. It would just be an effect that with this model would fit all the data and make predictions that are kind of interesting, which is if you did do a further test of carbon dating the shroud, if you pick samples from some of these high date regions and other regions that would be lower dating, you're going to do 2 things. You're going to redate the shroud, but you'd also be doing a dating that would test whether or not this thermal neutron hypothesis is consistent with the data. If it is, quite frankly, I think it would be absolutely amazing if it was, but if it was, John Jackson levitated off the chair. It's an experimentally demonstrable thing. You can make an experiment to test this hypothesis, and everybody wants to do the carbon dating of the shroud over anyway. So if you work it right, you could carbon date the shroud, and you might discover that parts of the shroud date from 3654. That would knock everybody's socks off. Tell me about it. Absolutely amazing. So one of the things that he thought was significant is that with a single amount model, he was able to explain the erroneous carbon dates or the anomalous carbon dates on from the shroud, and also the carbon dating of the Sudarium of Oviedo. That is remarkable. That's remarkable and worth testing. Okay. So it would be nice to have a better protocol for carbon-14 sampling. What was done in 1988 was deplorable, but this is a testable hypothesis. And it would, with a better carbon-14 sampling protocol, we could find out whether or not thermal neutrons might have been involved in the empty tomb, or in the tomb with the shroud. But the thermal neutrons don't explain the image. This isn't something that explains the image. This would explain all the carbon dates. Now, the second paper by Spicer and Toten looks to explain the image, and there were some prefatory that basically we're moving beyond the Vignon vaporograph theory, beyond the Rogers impurity theory, to what might be called the electric vaporograph theory. Why would this be different? Well, they start out their paper, and this is a quote from the paper, and I'll just go through the 6 items. Images on the cloth exist only on the dorsal and ventral surfaces of body, and these images lie only on the fibers found at the extremities of the region of the cloth. No image or discoloration exists between the 2 surfaces of cloth. That is, there's no image between, in the middle of the thread. There's no image of the top of the head. Now I think maybe that might be because there was a cloth over the top of the head, but it's true, there's no image of the top of the head. Or the sides of the body. Okay, that is a problem, because obviously the cloth draped down, it was over the top of the head and draped down on the sides of the body. That's a clue as to image mechanism. The image cannot have just radiated in every direction away from the body, or you'd have distortions and side images. You don't. The image density on the cloth appears to embody information on the vertical distance between the cloth and portion of the ventral body images, as if the cloth were held flat and horizontal slightly above the body, or in the case of the dorsal image, between the cloth on the entire, I don't know, either the floor or shelf on which the body laid, should have been laid, and the back of the body. In essence, the closer the cloth was to the body, the darker the image, and the further away, the fainter the image. And of course, that's the 3D effect we've talked about before. The body image is visible in areas where there was no contact between the body and the cloth. Same deal. The coloration does not appear under the threads where they cross in the weave of the cloth. Okay, that's, I'd go a little further in there and say the coloration doesn't appear under the surface fibrils of the threads. Okay, so we talked last time about things like collimation, and what their model says is we have a quasi-static electric field. I mentioned electric fields last time, and I had not actually looked at this particular presentation, even though I was there for it. I hadn't looked at the visuals from it. But there is electric fields that naturally occur. And the thing that's unique about this is the idea that, wait a second, if you have an electric field and you have polar molecules, the presence of the electric field in interacting with the polar molecules will line them all up. And then there will be a tendency for them not to diverge the way they do in diffusion, because the strength of the electric field is stronger than the diffusion. And he points out that water, this is the dipole moment of 3 different molecules, all of which would be present on the body. Water, ammonia, and these, by the way, this is 10 to the minus 30, and 10 to the minus 29 is 10 times bigger than 10 to the minus 30. So what he's pointing out is urea is much, much stronger as a dipolar molecule than the other 2, both of which have also been talked about as components in in possibly a vaporograph type of imaging. So what happens is the electric field entrains the molecules and makes them move up. It does something else because it polarizes the cloth. The cloth's an insulator. So when it's exposed to an electric field, it causes charge separation to occur. Remember I mentioned balloons on the wall? You've done this. I know everybody's rubbed a balloon and stuck it on the wall. That adhesion is caused by the charge separation. That's what happens. And they propose what happened is because of the charge separation, it went to the surface of the cloth and it preferentially caused the urea to go and oxidize the outermost surface of the cloth. So that answers a little bit of the image mail. It clarifies a possible mechanism to make the image have higher resolution, and it gives another explanation possibly to the only appearing at the very surface of the fibers. So, and by the way, this is a testable hypothesis. So the first thing they did is they tossed out a challenge to the coronal discharge people. Coronal discharge requires voltages that are hugely higher than the voltages this would require. And all the, Giulio Fonte and the coronal discharge crowd have all the equipment in place to do this experiment, so they tossed a challenge out. Because these is a bunch of theoreticians. They're not going to do the experiment. So somebody should do the experiment, because this is testable. You ought to be able to make an image with this if you can make it work. That would be cool. So moving on, we'll look at the 2 more interesting things. Better images with meaningful data. What if we had a complete high-resolution image of the shroud at the resolution of the Mark Evans micrographs? You saw the Mark Evans micrographs, some of them anyway, as we went along. What if we could actually identify the man? Those are 2 other questions. It would be nice to have high-resolution multispectral images. It's hard to imagine things we couldn't do. We could learn all about the image. But what about actually identifying the man? If you could identify the man on the shroud, now I don't mean by identifying him to necessarily identify him as Jesus Christ. We don't know what the DNA of Jesus Christ is. But we could certainly discover whether the DNA on the shroud is the same as the DNA on the Sudarium of Oviedo. We could certainly find out whether there is any blood on some of these tunics that were supposed to be around Jesus on the journey to Calvary. If you got multiple DNA samples and could link all of those relics, I think it'd be reasonably fair to say that the same man was involved in the events that created these particular artifacts. Now the HAL 9000 in 2008, 22nd of January, an outfit in Europe called HAL 9000 took the highest resolution images of the whole shroud ever taken. There were over 1,600 credit card image size images which could be composited together to form a high resolution picture of the whole shroud, something like 12.8 billion pixels, 72 gigabytes of data. Now you can't get this data, at least not in full. Here is a picture of, with a watermark they've gratefully added, so to give you an idea of what it looks like. In order to make it a little more visible, I extended the contrast ratio here, and here is a picture of the Durante 2002 image that's on Shroud Scope. And you can see that it's pretty good, but it isn't this high in resolution. This is higher resolution. The whole shroud has been imaged at this resolution, and they haven't released the images. It just ticks me off beyond belief as someone who, I would instantly find a big data repository to stick the 72 gigabytes in so I could fool with it and find out more about the shroud. And I don't see the reason why there is an application you can get if you're an iPod user. Check Shroud 2.0, Google Shroud 2.0, and these folks have got some mechanism where they'll let you look at images that they took, but they haven't been released to the scientific community as a whole. I sure would like them to do. Here's the outfit, and I'll leave the slide up for a minute if anybody's interested in copying the URL, but you could probably find this URL just by Googling Shroud 2.0. Yes, ma'am?
I just wanted to go back on the electric charge theory for just a moment. Is that due to the resurrection, the electric charge?
No. That's an entirely naturalistic.
It would happen, and it could happen.
It could happen anytime, anywhere. The electric field. You have noticed lightning, haven't you?
Yeah.
There are some big electric fields floating around the Earth, and they're commonly present, but you don't notice them because they don't produce macroscopic and obvious results. But there are electric fields. The Earth has a natural electric field. It's not entirely electrically neutral, so there's actually an electric field everywhere around the Earth.
So do you imagine that they'll actually try the experiment? That they'll take the challenge?
Oh yeah, I think somebody's going to do the experiment. Someone will do that experiment. It's not that hard an experiment. If I had the time and the money and it'll take a little equipment because you got to set up. I bought a piece of linen cloth, pure linen cloth that's larger than the shroud. I haven't decided what to do with it. My wife was kind of irritated because it's been lying around the living room. $60 worth of pure linen, 15 yards long, and I don't know how many, a yard and a half wide or something, So it's a big piece of linen. I was thinking about trying to do some of the vaporograph kind of experiments. Theoretically, in principle, I pretty much have the stuff that would be required to do such an experiment, but it would be a pain in the neck. I don't have a laboratory or anything, but I know how to do it. So.
Okay,
Now, here's some other guys that are into the DNA. I put these up because I'd sort of neglected to mention these guys before. This guy, Garza Valdez, wrote a book called The DNA of God. And he was a discoverer that some of the threads of the shroud are covered with a material that he called bioplastic. And bioplastic is the leftover material produced by various kinds of microbiological activity. And he's something of an expert on the bioplastic material because he studied it on Aztec porcelains or something that they ended up with a shine, and people thought that somehow they had put an enamel on them or something, and no, it wasn't. It was natural biological activity that had produced it. And he thought possibly that this could be an explanation for the bad carbon date. Well, since it's been shown that there just isn't enough of this bioplastic material. It's not widespread enough, and there simply isn't physically enough of it to do it. But he also was looking at the DNA of God. Now, a lot of people, he wrote this book. There are now quite a few novels about cloning Jesus, and stuff like that, which is going way beyond anything that I can't really blame Garza Valdez for the novels, but he's the first one to make a big deal about the DNA. Now, DNA is pretty interesting stuff. There's a lot of DNA on the shroud. There's a lot of, because the shroud has been touched, rubbed, kissed, and there's DNA from probably hundreds, if not thousands of people on the Shroud of Turin in tiny, tiny quantities, very tiny quantities. So just because you capture a piece of DNA and use some technology to multiply the DNA so that you can study it, doesn't mean you're looking at DNA of the man of the shroud. It could be DNA of some priest who kissed the shroud, or some one of the nobility of Europe who were working on doing mending on the shroud, reattaching the backing cloth. There's all kinds of people who have touched the shroud. But the whole question of DNA is kind of interesting. There's blood on the shroud, there's blood on the... now, blood is composed of multiple things. It is composed of red blood cells, but it also has white blood cells. Now, it turns out, I'm learning a little bit about this. I was talking to a doctor friend of mine because I could have sworn he told me there was mitochondrial DNA and red blood cells, but he said no, he didn't. He never said anything like that. It wasn't true. There's no mitochondrial DNA and red blood cells. And I said, oh, okay. So then I had to go back and and sort of apologize mentally to myself for being stupid. And I went and looked around, and it turns out there's all kinds of DNA in white blood cells. So I wasn't entirely wrong. Unfortunately, white blood cells are only 1% of the blood, but there's plenty of white blood cells on the Shroud of Turin. So finding the key is obviously getting into some white blood cells and getting the DNA out. There's two kinds of DNA. So no DNA in red blood cells, lots of DNA in the white blood cells. The problem, of course, is knowing whose DNA you're looking at, but if you can find yourself some white blood cells, or convincingly get multiple samples of DNA from different regions that type to the same person, you can be fairly confident that you've got the DNA of the man of the shroud. And then you can do some other things. So there's nuclear DNA, which is, there's not that much of nuclear DNA, but it's in the nucleus, and there's a lot more DNA, although it's simpler DNA. There's in the surrounding cell, inside the cell. The one DNA is called nuclear DNA, 2 copies per cell, 20,000 to 30,000 total genes. That's what makes you who you are. Then the other one does other stuff. It's 100. There's 100 to 10,000 copies, so there's a little DNA of a complex character. And the mitochondrial DNA, there's more of it, but it's less complex. It only has 37 genes, and it only comes from the mother. So this comes from both parents, this comes from the mother. That's interesting. So can we connect the dots? Well, if we got multiple samples of DNA from the same artifact that typed to the same degree, then you could say, okay, that's pretty good evidence that it's the same that's the person that's in the shroud. So multiple samples from different related artifacts, like the Sudarium of Oviedo. I mentioned that nuclear DNA was from both parents and mitochondrial DNA from an... Now the problem, of course, is all this DNA is quite old, and we don't know. People are always talking about the DNA degrading. And I'm not sure whether it's feasible to do this, but if it is, and this was brought up at the conference, then it is certainly possible to link possibly all these different relics of Christ. I wanted to mention Bruno Barberis. Bruno was at the St. Louis conference. He is the president of the International Center of Syndenology in Turin. Now, I don't know that that gives him a heck of a lot of power, but it makes him a voice in Turin. Because I think this is sort of a citizens group. I don't really know how the group, I suspect that they're consulted by the people who control the shroud. And he recently said, we need new data if we want to continue in the search, and proposes to organize a real laboratory around the shroud. Well, that's an interesting comment, and I would certainly like to see something like that happen, but it would be also very nice if they would involve the international community of scientists that are interested in the shroud in the work. So I herald Bruno's support for more science on the shroud, and I would like to see him involve all of the shroud scientists and not just the chosen few. So the future awaits. There are a lot of avenues of exploration. I've just mentioned a couple that would be very interesting, especially if they panned out. I think it would be absolutely amazing if we got a 3800 or 3654 date on a sample from the shroud that was near the bulk of the body. That would blow my mind, I can tell you. The future clarification of the history and science. I think we need more research into textiles. I would certainly like to be able to say how it is that we have such a unique and fine textile in the Shroud of Turin and place it historically in the world of textiles. So far, I've read what I can find on that subject, and nothing is very helpful, other than the fact that this is an extraordinarily fine linen that would normally have been created to be used for apparel and not for some low use. And so I think the story that this is linen that came from the temple store, while speculative, is the most convincing story I've heard yet. So we are left with this question: who do you say that I am? Perhaps I've only served to increase your mystification. I certainly know I'm pretty mystified by this whole thing. What is the Shroud of Turin? Is it a relic of Jesus Christ? Or is it some kind of mysterious icon that some brilliant, and they'd have to be brilliant, extraordinarily brilliant artificer created? And finally, what does it mean? Why is there this mysterious image on this amazing cloth? And finally, you have to make the decision for yourself. Nobody can decide for you. And I'd like to plug Stira. Stira is the group. It's a nonprofit that's been created by Barry Schwartz so that when he dies, the materials he's collected from the Shroud of Turin Research Project will continue to be preserved and taken care of. If you want the most authoritative website on the web for Shroud of Turin material, shroud.com is that website. And if you go to shroud.com/PDFs, PDFS, you find a huge number of technical papers on the Shroud. You spend the next 3 years reading them, you know. And, somebody needs to maybe provide a annotated index to the papers that are available. And also, I would like to plug Russ Brialt's shrouduniversity.com, which has many videos of talks that were given, including yours truly. My talk at the St. Louis conference can be found on one of the first links on shrouduniversity.com. On the other hand, I stole about all the slides and slipped them in one place or another in the talks you've been exposed to over the past. So you would, if you look at that video, you would recognize a number of the slides, I think. That's about it. And I'm, amazingly enough, I'm actually finishing early, so I must not have talked enough. If there are any questions that I can answer, or any help I could offer anyone who's interested in further study of the Shroud of Turin, I'd be more than happy to do that. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the cross that Christ carried. I'd heard that it would only have been one piece of the cross that he carried.
Well, we don't know. There's two traditions about Christ carrying the cross. Is that what you're getting at? Mm-hmm. One tradition is that he carried the whole cross, but that's probably not accurate. I mean, that's very popular in art,
Yeah.
but in reality, what was done is that the cross. If they had to carry the whole cross, you've got a problem securing the vertical beam.
Yes.
Because they'd have to dig a hole and have to set that up. And the place where Christ was crucified is a place where they commonly crucified people. This was, after all, not an unusual punishment. It was a very low punishment. I mean, it was punishment for the worst of the worst criminals. It was punishment that Paul got out of because he was a Roman citizen. You did not crucify Roman citizens, only the slaves and people of low estate. But that vertical beam had to stay in place. So the idea that he carried the whole cross is pretty unrealistic. Also, just that video, if you saw the video that was on the other evening, they made the comment that the cross weighed 300 pounds.
Yeah.
That's what I was gonna
I don't know about you. Anybody in here want to try to lift 300 pounds and carry and walk it a mile or so? I don't think so. I mean, that's a nice story, but
Dogwood tree.
excuse me.
That would have been a big dogwood tree.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but that's one heck of a load. I don't think that a man that could even lift it typically. Now, Christ was probably a pretty strong guy, but he'd just been.
He couldn't lift it and get it up on his
lashed
shoulder.
severely. He was definitely reduced. The patibulum is what Giulio Risi thinks he was carrying. And not only that, he has a whole, now I don't know what he bases it on, but he has a whole idea about how the patibulum was attached. In order that the prisoner not just throw the cross to the ground and try to run away, he claims that the patibulum was attached with a chain or rope to the foot of the person carrying the patibulum. The patibulum is the crossbeam. Not only that, but the other end of the patibulum was tied to the persons in front of him, so that someone walking would be doubly secured. He'd be tied to the if there were multiple people going to be crucified, he'd be tied to the one in front, and he'd be tied, and the crucifix would be, the patibulum would be tied to his own feet, so that if he couldn't run away. He was tied in two directions. And also, if he couldn't keep up, he'd almost be pulled down as far as falling. Because the person in front of them, if he was handling his patibulum more easily than you were handling yours, then he would actually tend to pull you down. I don't know if that reconstruction by Ricci is entirely correct, but he does have illustrations in his book. He wrote a book called The Holy Shroud. It was originally published in Italian, but there are available copies. You go to that, if you go to Amazon.com, none of these are in print, but Amazon seems to have every book in the universe in there, and if it's not in print, they'll have some link that says for 99 cents or something, and shipping, you can get the book, or for $5,320. It depends on how rare the book is and how much demand there is. I've been trying to find Paul Vignon's second book, which was printed in the 30s, which goes into depth on his Vignon marking theory. And I think I told you this story. I saw one copy once for $120. I said, "Oh, I'm not going to pay $120."
And now you're sorry.
And I've never seen it again. When I went back, my wife said, "Well, buy it. You wanted to buy it." And I went back and it was gone. So I've got to find one. Yes, ma'am.
Does the International Center of Sinology in Turin cooperate with Stira? Do they work together?
I don't really know, but they came. Bruno was at the conference in St. Louis, and that's very encouraging because I don't want to say that anything bad on camera about anybody in Turin, because I really want to see a growing cooperation between all of the scientists that work on the Shroud.
So
it would be nice. But frankly, there's not a whole lot of communication, is my impression. But the Shroud's on exhibit this year. There are undoubtedly conferences. I'm not going. I'm a cheapskate, and I'm retired and broke, and probably not want to spend my money that way. But there will be people going, and undoubtedly there'll be some talk about Bruno's comment about more science. That's something we've been looking to have happen for a long time. I certainly hope it does happen. That would be terrific. I don't know if that helps.
Yes.
Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
How did Hal get those images? You said how HAL took images?
How did they do it?
How were they able to acquire the right to do that?
Well, they got permission. They were very well. They had done scans of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, which they had put up online, so you could look at any part of Leonardo's fresco of the Last Supper at arbitrary. You could zoom in on each part through the internet. Now, I don't know whether the church clearly allowed it, whether or not the church owns the images or whether the company that took the images owns the images. I'm a little disturbed that the images are in a sort of a commercial venue with watermarks. But if you have an iPad and I don't know what, it's not, I think it's very approachable how much, I think that it's like a few bucks to get the application. You can get it through iTunes or something. Say, I'm not a big Apple fan, so I don't have an iPad, and I really wish they would put these images, make them available. But then they put watermarks on them, which kind of reduces their usefulness for scientific purposes. So they've kind of turned this thing into a semi-commercial popularization, and that annoys me a little bit. I'd like to see the images themselves offered for research purposes.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
After Jesus' resurrection, didn't Mary, his mother, go in the tomb?
Probably. We don't know about Mary, the
Mary
mother of
Magdalene?
Jesus. Certainly the women were at the tomb. They were on their way to the tomb with, so
But I was gonna say, if she was there and touched the shroud, then you'd have her DNA, and if it matched with his DNA.
Well,
then
how would you know which DNA was
Well,
which?
if one of them matched his.
Well, that'd be interesting, if you had a DNA, if you had nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA from Mary,
Yeah.
and then you had a separate DNA, and the mitochondrial DNA matched, because it comes from the mother, that would be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a cool idea. I
mean,
I don't know what the
you'd have to-
probability of it actually
Well,
happening
you'd
would
have to
be.
test all the blood, I guess, of DNA to find one that was related.
Well, frankly, the DNA stuff is probably at this point fairly speculative, because it really depends on whether or not you can get old DNA to type adequately in order to make the matches. But if you can, that'd be terrific.
But archaeologists are getting DNA out of mummies in
Yeah.
Egypt, so why not?
You would think so, but I don't know how much detail they can get out of the mummies. But they do get detailed DNA, they get blood samples from mummies, a lot of stuff like that.
Jesus.
It's certainly possible.
Eventually.
I haven't seen any evidence yet that it will be done or can be done. You gotta remember that the only samples of the shroud are extraordinarily minute. They're just like stuff that came off the shroud on the sticky tape. That's it. That's not much. And a lot of these were worked on and worked over, so that to do this kind of stuff, you probably need new data, new samples. All right, anybody else? It has been a pleasure speaking to you. I hope you've enjoyed the course, and I don't know whether it'll be given again, but with any luck, Russ Briall will put it up online at shrouduniversity.com, and you can tell your friends about it or something. So thank you very much.
Thank you.